Dr. Lograj. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in today's webinar, and I'm grateful to you and to the Pro Vice Chancellor and other authorities of SRM for inviting me to share my thoughts on something which is very close to our heart, competency-based postgraduate medical education, because we have to do it and not wait for the regulatory agency to come with clear guidelines, which may take some time. So I'm not going to talk theory today, but I'm going to talk of our own experiences in this process and share with you some of the difficulties we had along the way, which will enable you to avoid those pitfalls and perhaps end up with a product which is even better than what we have produced. So the theme of my talk today is competency-based postgraduate medical education in the Indian context, because we in India face certain situations which is unique and which is not really parallel with those experienced abroad. Now, this man, Bert Lance, was Secretary Office of Management and Budget, the term that they use in US for a post equivalent to our finance minister. And he said long ago in Jimmy Carter's time, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it because you may have a product which is worse than what was there before. So we started our journey in this process in 2013, 5 years after SBV became a deemed to be university in 2008. By looking at our postgraduate process and seeing and answering some of these questions which we had to answer before we create a turmoil in the system. The first thing we'll have to answer when the faculty are faced with faculty development programs is why change? What's wrong with the current systems? Will the students welcome the change and benefit by it? Will the educational outcome improve for the students, for the institution, and for the profession as a whole? Will it involve a lot of extra work for faculty and students? Will regulatory agencies approve? And personally, for the faculty who are going to struggle hours and hours together, will change bring recognition? We anticipated these questions when we started. Then we did a review of our postgraduate medical education process. You know, the regulations for postgraduate are not as regular as the undergraduate from the erstwhile MCI and the current National Medical Commission. 83 and was followed by 2000 for postgraduate, and after 2000 only now has the new draft regulation come for postgraduate medical education. And for the undergraduate after 97, the next one was 2017 when the competency-based system was introduced. So it takes a long time for the regulator to get into the process. And we can't really wait for the regulator, but we have to do something because this topic is immediate. We all know that there is a sense of inadequacy with the postgraduates after qualification. That's why they don't really go and start on their own or take up any job of responsibility, but they do fellowships or they try to do MCH or DM or work somewhere or the other because they don't feel independent at the time of graduation and they don't feel that they are efficient enough. The second major problem is the system does not emphasize professionalism and attitude, nor does it emphasize evaluation of this, which is probably the most important part of the profession. In the postgraduate system, there is no formative assessment worth the name or a meaningful feedback. There's absolutely no scope for reflection. And in current andragogy or utagogic mode, reflective learning is the most important part, which shifts facts from recent memory to remote memory. And the system treats all of us as alike, and those who are lagging behind have no opportunity for special inputs. And the summative examination, we know it's not even a one-day match. It's now become a one case match. If you do that case well, you pass. If you don't do that case well, whatever you do in the rest of the examination is not going to change the outcome, which is very, very undesirable. The system also does not test the higher levels of Miller's pyramid, the dust part. And if you see the questioning, and I've been postgraduate examiners innumerable times from MS to MCH and surgical gastroenterology, it all revolves at the recall level. Very rarely does it go beyond that and test the ability to do. So there are a lot of problems, and the system certainly requires change to produce more competent outgoing postgraduates. A conscious decision was then made by us to change from the old content oriented objective based system, and that is the problem even today. If you look at the CBME regulations of MCI of 2017, although it's called competency, when you look at the 3 volumes of over 3,000 competencies which are there, many of them are long answer questions, many of them are objectives, some of them are short answer questions, and very few are actually competencies as they should be stated with measurable outcomes. So we wanted to change to an outcome based model which allows for continuous monitoring and feedback, which allows for reflective learning, which allows for varying the pace for students with different learning styles, which has well defined outcome standards, and ensures to the extent possible that 100% of our students reach 100% of the requirements prior to the final exams. And all this, of course, we had to do within regulatory guidelines because we can't go beyond the guidelines. Worldwide, the system of competency-based medical education, which is in the lowest box there, allows for flexible time. If the student does not reach the outcomes necessary, there is a scope for extension of the course. The standards are fixed, the time is flexible, but that is certainly not permissible in India. Therefore, we had to evolve a model where the standards can be fixed, but the time also has to be fixed to 3 years, which is the time permitted by the regulatory agency. And this thought was the result of our own model, which we call the COBOLT model or the competency based learning and training model of SBB. Once we made a decision, we adopted Epstein's decision, which is classical in pedagogy. The competency is the habitual and judicious use of communication, knowledge, technical skills, reasoning, emotions, values, reflections. And what is important is what all these which are useful in day-to-day practice. That is what is important. Not remotely, but in day-to-day practice. We had to focus on those attributes. Having made a decision, we then started with our faculty development programs. And when you are starting, please be aware that it will take a long time to get all the faculty in line. It took us 2 years from 13 to 15 to have the system properly planned, everybody trained, and then the batch of postgraduates admitted in 2016, we introduced it for the first time, and now it's there for the last 5 years. The faculty development programs have to focus on what is meant by outcome and why it has not been clearly defined in the MCI or the NMC regulations. Recently, of course, they have defined what is meant by the Indian medical graduate. They have still to define what is meant by the Indian medical postgraduate and what should be the attributes. We had to convince the faculty of clear outcome attribute definition, make a accepted defined list of skills which they must have at the time of qualification, match the TL methods with the defined requirement of skills and knowledge, ensure that we have appropriate methods of formative assessment because summative assessment is not under our control, to ensure the skill acquisition and have a system of continuous monitoring and feedback. We all know, those of us who have been in postgraduate education, that the logbook is far from satisfactory. It's a dynamic process, often written by the junior postgraduate at the time of examination, with no contribution from the exam going student at all. And that can never be used for continuous monitoring or feedback because it is not maintained on a day-to-day basis. This is known to everybody, but nothing has been done about this from the time we started post-graduation in the Indian systems. We can define the outcomes in terms of attributes, but we have to make it measurable so that everybody who measures will have the same score for the student. And therefore, we had to drive home in our faculty development programs that competencies refer to qualities or attributes of the graduate, and they have to be rewritten in a format which can be measured directly or indirectly by so-called performance indicators. And this term, which has been used from the turn of the century abroad, is what is called an entrustable professional activity. When they reach this entrustable stage, it means they can be entrusted to be performed independently as specialists. To ensure that they reach that stage, we have to make sure that they are monitored at intervals by defining what are called milestones at different stages of training: 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, so on and so forth, and 36 months before they appear for the final examination. This concept of EPA was very difficult to get across to the faculty, and we had to focus our efforts on this for a long time and define an EPA as a measurable outcome indicator to certify attainment of that attribute to a level where the candidate can be trusted to perform independently and define the stages of entrustment. And when you certify the entrustment of the candidate at the required level, that means they have reached the proficiency to function independently as a functioning specialist in their day-to-day life after they qualify. EPAs differ from objectives in many ways. Objectives are usually unidimensional. They either refer to knowledge, attitude, skills, communication. Rarely do we find objectives which are multidimensional, whereas EPAs are by definition multidimensional. But we also have to know that certain parts of the syllabus cannot be rewritten as entrustable professional activity, and therefore we need to cover those syllabus in the routine fashion. One EPA can denote several competencies. They should be executable independently or under supervision, depending on the milestone, and they should be measurable, satisfactorily measurable, and it should refer to what is essential in professional activity. They cannot refer obviously to those skills which will be required once in a lifetime, because then you'll be wasting a lot of teaching time on focusing on those. Since the IMG was not defined with the 5 subdomains at that time, we adopted the ACGME 6 subdomains for writing our EPAs, and these 6 subdomains were medical knowledge, patient care, communication skills, professionalism, practice-based learning and improvement, and system-based practice. We are now rewriting our EPAs to conform to the 5 subdomains of the IMG. As I said, one EPA may involve several subcompetencies. It may test knowledge, it may test patient care, it may test system-based practice or professionalism. And we need to know what it tests so that we match the teaching learning tools to teach that subdomain, and we have our assessment tool to measure that subdomain. Because obviously, and that is the main pitfalls of the newly introduced 8COM module. 8COM refers to a lot of soft skills, but if you see the module, the assessment has been written as a MCQ. Now, MCQs cannot measure soft skills. There is a mismatch between the assessment domain and the domain of the subcompetency. And that is why we are people who are implementing 8COM have a lot of problems in ensuring that those attributes are reached. We had to drive home the differences between the old competency and the EPAs. And this slide is taken from Ollie Tenkate from Holland. And he says very clearly that EPAs are not alternates to competencies, but a means to translate competency into clinical practice, to make them observable, measurable, and an activity for which feedback can be given objectively. Competencies are descriptors of physicians' attitudes, and EPAs are descriptors of work. That was very, very popular with the faculty when we asked them to start writing the EPAs. EPAs, as I said before in the previous slide, require several competency domains. And again, I'm saying they must refer to 90% of the day-to-day work only. The advantages, of course, are very clear. They focus on outcomes. They measure real-time performance in the workplace. And now you know the whole world has already moved to workplace-based assessment for postgraduate education, not in the artificial situation of an examination hall where the examiner sits in a different room, the candidates are examining in a different room. And in one center where I went for examination, we were not even on the same floor. The candidates were in the first floor and the examiners were having their samosas in the second floor while the examination was going on. And that system of examination, I don't think what it achieves. I am not sure. I've been part of that for so many times. The advantages of EPAs are that they focus on outcomes. They measure real-time performance. And more than that, they insist that the teacher on a regular basis, be it day to day or be it week to week, monitors the progress and gives a feedback, supervises, provides inputs where required, and corrects where correction is required. Reflective learning should be promoted every time, and the progress must be recorded on a continuous basis till we are sure that this candidate is safe for entrustment to happen. We call the heads of departments and then assign them this task to list areas of competency in different domains in their own subjects, rewrite them as entrustable professional activities which reflect the outcome in a measurable way. I'll come to this problem of milestones and then decide once they've written the EPAs, define methods of formatively assessing attainment of the EPA level and make sure that at the time of graduation they align with the requirements of the graduate when he goes out into society, which means that he has reached the level of entrustment. Each EPA has a title, it is a statement of outcome, it has a context, it lists the domains involved, and I'll show you examples of these. It tells you the subdomains, it tells you the milestones, it also tells you the workplace-based assessment method for formative assessment during the 3-year process, and it defines the level at which the entrustment can be achieved. There are, of course, very many attributes which can affect this whole process. The training quality was a big issue in the beginning, but over 5 years, this system is now working very satisfactorily. And the reluctance of the teachers was another issue that we have to solve, and that can be only solved by making them partners to the change rather than deciding on the change and making them partners only for implementation. If you do that, then you are going to have breaks at every point. Now, coming back to milestones, what is meant by milestones? Milestones is the level the candidate reaches at different points of the learning cycle, starting from the day of entry till the day he appears in the final year examination. So for defining milestones, we require two inputs. One is, when are we going to measure it? That is the chronological period of study. Is it at entry? Is it at 3 months? Is it at 6 months? Is it at 1 year? And the second input that we require is what level he should have reached at that point in journey. So for defining these levels, milestones chronologically is easy. We made a decision that in the first year we'll do it every 3 months. In the second year, we'll probably do it every 4 to 6 months. And in the final year, we'll have at least 2 assessments before they appear for the examination. Those are the chronological milestones. Now, the level milestones are, we adopted the Dreyfus model, which is by far the most popular. Miller's model, which is used for the undergraduates in the CBME curriculum, is not very suitable for postgraduate education. And the Dreyfus model defines levels in five different stages of development, starting from the novice to the expert. And the definition of those levels is on the left-hand side of the slide. Novice is one who cannot perform or who requires only to observe and learn initially. And then he advances to advanced beginner, where they can perform under strict supervision, almost as if somebody is holding their hands and helping them. Then they progress to competent stage, where they can perform under loose supervision, where the teacher observes but does not actually require to handhold. And then they become proficient, where they can be left to do the act independently with the teacher available for help if required, not being physically present at the spot. The expert level comes after several years of practice in the subject, and therefore it is not a level that is attainable during postgraduate education. So we can target only up to 4. Now, there are certain complex skills. For instance, in my own subject, if you take the skill of doing a pancreatic resection, is not something that can be learnt in 3 years' time. So the postgraduates will probably reach only level 3, where they can perform under loose supervision, with the teacher being present all the time and guiding them step by step. For some other things like the surgery for a hernia or the wound management or other appendicitis or removal of gallbladder, they can reach level 4, but at no point do we ever target level 5 during postgraduate education. It is not feasible and it is not possible. 1 or 2 candidates may reach, but we cannot ensure that 100% of students will reach that level. So we adopted the Dreyfus model and then the milestones chronologically. And this is a descriptor of these levels. What is meant by level 1 is they are not allowed to do the APA themselves. They require only to observe others doing and learn. And before that, they must develop the knowledge which is required as a background to doing that skill. In level 2, they're allowed to practice EPA only under proactive full supervision. In level 3, they're allowed to practice EPA with the supervisor available on the spot and being there ready to step in if required. And on level 4, they're allowed to practice unsupervised with remote monitoring. So that is the target of our competency-based education. This slide repeats what I said about milestones as stages in development of competency, both chronologically and as per the level. So we say at 3 months, they should have reached from novice to level 1, level 2 in some skills. There will be certain skills like history taking, which is taught during undergraduation, where even at entry, they should be at stage level 4 because they must be able to do it independently without supervision. So there comes the importance of writing EPAs, where you define the entry milestones, and then if they're already at 4, our efforts can then focus on other EPAs instead of wasting our time on those where they've already reached the required level. But nevertheless, they must be stated in the EPA list so that it's not forgotten that they have to reach those competencies also. Once we were ready for launching, we launched this in the year 2016. We had each department, all the postgraduate departments, had a list of EPAs. The number of EPAs varied from 25 to 40 for each department, and I'll show you some departmental list. We gave this EPAs to the postgraduates the day they entered the institute so that they are familiar with what is required of them in the course and at the end. And we made a decision that we'll ask them to assess themselves on the day of entry against those, the list provided to them. They can call themselves 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was surprised one candidate in radiology, he had marked 4 for everything. So I asked him, you have just finished MBBS and you say you are expert. And he said, my father runs a radiology clinic I've been working there for the last 3 years. I just come here for a degree and I don't really require any training. When we gave him back the assessment at the end of 1 month by the faculty had graded him as level 2, level 1, level 3 at various levels. And he realized by reflection the gap between his own self perception and objective assessment based on fixed guidelines. So, that is what is the importance of giving it to them on the day of entry and asking them to do a reflective exercise. I'll show you some examples. Yeah, this is the list of EPAs. I'm showing this only for seeing the structure. I know that it cannot be really read if it's in a large hall. There's a serial number, and then if you go down, it goes to 46 EPSN and the Department of Otorhinolaryngology. It starts with basic skills like gathering history and performing physical examination. These indicate the sub-competency domains: medical knowledge, patient care, practice-based learning and improvement, system-based practice, professionalism, and interprofessional and communication skills as per the ACGME, and now we will rewrite it in the IMG language. The requirement on the first day of residency, you will say history taking. Why is it 2? It should have been 4. They have finished the MBBS course. But the faculty in the Department of ENT said history taking in ENT is slightly different from history taking which we teach to the MBBS. And therefore, we don't expect them to be able to take history in the form that we want on the day of entry. And therefore, we expect most of them to be at level 2 and we require to guide them till they reach level 4 at the end of second year. And they will become so good at the end of training that they'll be able to teach the undergraduates, and therefore they have reached the expert level. This was a decision driven by consensus. It was not only our own faculty in our own departments who wrote the EPAs. Once the EPAs were listed, we had a lot of faculty from outside the institute coming and working in our workshops and commenting on the EPAs, both in structure, number, the writing, and the desirable levels. So this is the exit level outcome required before we send them for final exam. You may ask us, can you stop them from appearing in the final exam? And the answer you know and I know is we cannot stop them. But we have to ensure to the extent possible that they reach these levels before they appear for the final exam. And the last column is about multi-source feedback, and I'll come to it a little later on. So you see this list of EPAs, and as we go, you come to more and more complex. Conducting pure tone audiometry and impedance audiometry. It involves knowledge, it involves patient care, it involves professionalism because you are dealing with patients. It involves communication with patients, and they will probably be at novice level and they have to be made to reach 4. So each department like this had to do this list of EPAs with the sub-competencies and the expected milestone levels. And you see here the multi-source feedback and the descriptors. S stands for the feedback from the supervisor. PG stands for peers, the other PGs. This P stands for undergraduate students, healthcare workers, and so on and so on. We even went beyond in having descriptors in other departments like this, because just writing levels may not be very clear. And therefore, we need to have a rubric in order to explain what we mean by milestone level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That is the expert level. And this is an example from our own Department of Anesthesiology. The knowledge area is demonstrates knowledge required for perioperative fluid management, blood and blood product administration. This is for an MDA anesthesiology. This shows milestone level 1, demonstrate knowledge of plasma volume expanders, mostly based on reading, demonstrate knowledge of blood and blood products, demonstrates knowledge of physiology behind fluid administration. All of this can be tested by written examination or viva versa. Let's go to milestone 4. In addition to all those in 3, and I'm not going to each one of them, but let me read one here. Milestone level 3 demonstrates knowledge of massive transfusion and its complications. See the difference between milestone 1 and milestone 3, and demonstrates knowledge of complications and management of fluid therapy, blood product administration. And when he reaches milestone 5, demonstrates knowledge in recent advances under transfusion rather than over transfusion, and so on and so forth. And is able to convey his thoughts to others and teach others. So this is a descriptive rubric of from anesthesiology. This is another one that was knowledge. This is patient care. Demonstrates ability to triage, resuscitate, manage patients requiring emergency critical care. And then at milestone level 5, you should be able to coordinate the crisis team and coordinate the transition to appropriate care facilities and serves as a consultant to other members of the healthcare team. So a lot of work has to go into defining these milestones and putting it actually down on paper as entrustable professional activity. And further, writing descriptive rubrics like this were required so that everybody is clear on what is required. The next decision we had to make was about professionalism and soft skills. Now, if you see, the postgraduate resident is the central piece of reaction with several peers, near peers, and supervisors. He has to deal with his departmental faculty and other faculty. He deals with the community, deals with other postgraduates, seniors and juniors. He deals with the nurses and other healthcare workers, patients and relatives all the time. But what determines whether he passes or fails is only his interaction with the examiners, which is not a correct way of either teaching professionalism or measuring professionalism. Therefore, we had to ensure that we get the opinion of all these people about the postgraduate regarding the soft skills before we declare them having reached level 4. So we had to go for feedback. And I'll just show you one feedback form that we made. For want of time, there are feedback forms for every category of workers, but I'm going to show you only one. This is the feedback form from residents and relatives and patients. Name of the residents, name of the respondent, the number, and so on. 10 attributes which have to be ranked. There are only 3 points. They have to decide whether it is what they expect of a doctor, whether it is less than what they expect, or it is better than what they expect. Because if you have a 10-point grading, it's not easy for patients to rank. And these are also written in the regional language in the questionnaire given to them, and written in a way that they understand. Are they respectful to you? Do they show any prejudice regarding your caste, language, community? Do they talk effectively? Are they willing to answer your questions? Are they available to you when your relatives come, and so on and so forth? This is the MSF form for the healthcare workers. And then we have for the other residents, the peer residents. And then we have for undergraduates and so on and so forth. We have forms from everybody. But the greatest problem in implementing MSF in our country is the hierarchy which exists in hospitals, where the medical personnel is at the top of the pyramid and the others are at the bottom levels, and therefore everybody hesitates to give feedback. Therefore, we have to build in a system where this is completely anonymous. Nobody's name is written except the name of the resident on whose the feedback is given. The name of the patient is not there, the relative is not there, the nurse is not there. It is given confidentially to the head of department, and it is meant only not for scolding or for taking corrective action, but to give feedback to the residents anonymously, saying that this is some of the opinions that we are getting, and what is your problem? Can we see how to improve from this status? So by that, over a period of years, we have now got MSF from most of the people that we require from. The cultural issues overcome by anonymity. Willingness was overcome again by making sure that Whatever they tell us is in strict confidence. There is always a problem of collusion, but that cannot be avoided. If you take it enough number of times, that will not be an issue. And the corrective steps is only in feedback, no punishment. We had to talk to a lot of nurses and other healthcare workers, operating room technicians, and so on and so forth to convince them this is required, to convince them that this is useful to the graduate, to convince them that their feedback will not be known to anybody except the faculty in charge. And after that process, it's destroyed. We achieved all this with a lot of training. And I want to leave some time for questions, and therefore I'll try to wind up by 2 or 3 slides. We had to monitor. If you want to do so many things, the logbook is not enough. And therefore, we developed, designed our own postgraduate e-portfolio, which has all these activities listed. It has learning modules where they are posted, for how long they are posted, feedback during those postings, all the clinical rotations they do, and the procedures that they do on a daily basis, and their scores on those procedures based on direct observation of procedural skills, their research in PG dissertation and its progress, the conferences they attend and achievements, presentation of papers, awards, and other things, the critical incidents, complications, side effects, drug reactions, and all that, very confidentially recorded. They have to submit documents confirming all this. Their scores on EPA assessment on a daily periodic basis, dissertation progress, MSF feedback, reflective learning, and so on and so forth. All these are structured into our portfolio, indigenously developed, and we use it on a regular basis. It's in our hub, and all postgraduates and other faculty have access to it. It's open only to the postgraduate and to the supervisor. And if he opens it, then to the other faculty. And when he completes the course, it's sealed and it's available only to him after several years. If he wants a testimonial or something, he can permit the faculty to again enter and then see what he has done and issue the testimonial. That can be done even after several years. But nobody else can see what is there. It is personal to the postgraduate concerned. The purpose of this portfolio was we realized that the logbook will not work and we need to monitor continuously to make sure that they have met these learning standards and other academic requirements. Enable interventions for those lagging behind so that if they are not reached that stage, maybe give them extra chances when we make the list of procedures for them to help or do independently, and create a lasting academic archive of their progress, which can be there in the university for their own use whenever they require. Sometimes they go from one state to another, particularly those who have gone abroad and they require testimonials or postings. And these are all time marked, and therefore the person who receives that will know that these have not been generated artificially. And we can even send it to them after getting permission from the concerned individual to show them the progress of this particular candidate. Software and expense was an issue, but since we had decided and the management was supporting us, this was not a great problem in designing this portfolio. We had to indigenize because our portfolio had to suit our purpose. We had to make provisions for space because they had to upload photographs of patients they had seen, or upload photographs for their dissertations, or upload their presentation, journal club activities, and so on and so forth. So the space had to be created, the server for that. The daily log also occupies space, and we had to encourage regularity of entries, not at the time of review. Initially, we did a review every month to see these portfolios to make sure that they were doing it regularly, both the faculty supervisors and the students. And we use good portfolios as models to motivate others. We had several problems. We want to focus on reflective learning, and we find after some time they don't enter reflections. Therefore, we have to call them and tell them what is the importance of reflection in their learning process and how it promotes transfer from recent memory to remote memory. Then if it is to work, there has to be mentorship and there has to be feedback. And if the faculty don't give feedback, then the students will lose faith in the portfolio. Therefore, that has to be ensured over a period of time. Also, we had to tell them these are all time and date stamped, and therefore, if you want to be regular, you have to do it at the appropriate time, otherwise, they will not carry any credit. The faculty, fortunately for us, came on board immediately because they had gone through the CPA process for 2 years before we launched, and therefore they understood the importance. And their role was to define competency standards, make decisions on progress, provide extra intervention where required, define milestones and see that they are monitored regularly, and provide mentorship, feedback, and see that at every time the candidate feels that there is somebody supporting him in the learning process. And the student's role was to collect and document evidence on a regular basis, defend the evidence by giving all attachments in support of that, be prepared to receive feedback, including constructive feedback from other health workers in the form of multi-source feedback, respond to the feedback wherever required, and reflect and write their reflections. I'll show you some examples of our portfolio. This is the page that we have in the portfolio. It's called the e-portfolios, the PGCBME. This is from one candidate. She is posted on 27th of July, and she writes on reflection about a case of carcinoma of the ascending colon, which is posted for minimally invasive or open hemicolectomy. The problem was anemia and hypoalbuminemia, and all that she saw in examination of the patient in the pre-anesthetic checkup, the actions she had taken, reserving 2 units of blood, 4 units of FFP, and then she had planned for epidural also because the minimally invasive may require conversion to open, and therefore she wrote, I planned for epidural also. And we started spirometry and all that to make sure this thing. And what was her problem? Difficult intubation was a problem because of the structure of the patient. And then the faculty concerned gives a feedback. This is on 27 July, and the same day the faculty has given feedback. Saranya, what is the significance of taking note of albumin in this case? How does it contribute to perioperative outcomes? So why are you bothered about anemia? And why is there is hypoalbuminemia in this particular case? And then the student has gone back and read and then written all this. Why there is hypoalbuminemia, what is the importance of albumin in fluid management, and so on and so forth. This is how a reflective portfolio should look like if it is done on a regular basis. And I'll show you one more as an example. This is about another patient who was posted for laparoscopic cholecystectomy and along with mesh hernia repair. And they had a difficult intubation failure in the first attempt. And I assume that this could be because I was not correct in choosing the endotracheal tube size. Maybe it's 7.5 was too big, and therefore that's why so much all this anticipated airway was there. And she says that I had a lot of problems in intubating. And then the head of the department and the director of e-learning, some of you would have met him, Professor Ravi Shankar, former head of anesthesiology in JIPMER. He asked, what was the effect of these repeated attempts of intubation on the systolic hypertension? This is the reflection, and this is the feedback on the reflection. And then she says, the on table was high, and then the BP fell to this much, and then it raised to this and all that. And then other faculty give feedback. So this has to be a continuous process. If you launch a postgraduate program without going through the whole hog, then it is doomed for failure, and everybody will come out of it dissatisfied, from the students to the faculty to the administration to the management, because by the time it fails, a lot of money, expense, and time would have been spent, and nobody likes to have all that wasted. Therefore, we have to be conscious that this is not an easy process. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of motivation, it takes a lot of drive, and we have to get everybody on board, from students, faculty, other healthcare workers, and administrators and management before it can be successfully launched. But the good thing is we did it. We didn't wait for the regulator to tell us. Till today, the regulator has not defined method of postgraduate competency-based education for postgraduates. And therefore, we are 5 years ahead of the regulator in this process. Finally, to summarize, our program structure started with listing competencies, converting to EPAs, assigning milestones, establishing mechanisms for monitoring and recording, fixing chronological milestones, allowing for reflection, providing for continuous regular feedback, maintaining confidentiality, establishing MSF, which is tremendously difficult, and ensuring that MSF continues satisfactorily, and ensuring that as far as possible, 100% attainment of levels is attained prior to the final examination. And all our experience we published in the National Medical Journal of India recently, and you can go through this article there. It's there stepwise. And we have also copyrighted this program, which is called the SBB Cobalt process. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.